Our headline story: the economic effect of South Africa's lockdown. Now, just months before the outbreak of the coronavirus, Africa's most industrialized economy entered recession. This would be the second recession in just 2 years for South Africa. Then came the COVID-19 pandemic. The country was now caught in the midst of reduced production, mismanagement, decades of mismanagement of state-owned entities, and lockdown. While vaccines were rolling out and lockdown restrictions were adjusted, there seemed to be light at the end of the tunnel. But on May 30th, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced that the country was back to alert level 2 adjusted regulations. All of this, plus the country's recession, have hit South Africa's economy hard. What is the economic effect of South Africa's lockdown? This is our focus today. I'm Tolilokwe Adelaru Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Now, South Africa's move to adjusted level 2 lockdown is unlikely to hamper economic recovery, but the rise of a third wave of COVID-19 infections and further restrictions could be damaging. The approach to restrictions after South Africa's second COVID-19 wave, the latest measures are focused on curbing social mobility and largely aim to keep the economy open. The new restrictions include: 1. The evening curfew will start 1 hour earlier at 2300 hours and end at 400 hours. The time adjustment allows employees and patrons to leave before the curfew starts. It now ends up with number 2, where non-essential businesses like restaurants, bars, and gyms will have to close by 10 p.m. local time. And number 3, all gatherings will be limited to a maximum of 100 people indoors and 250 people outdoors. It is expected that some households in South Africa would fall into positions of food insecurity with this latest restriction. The reduced capability to buy food has been brought about by the severe shock to household income, rather than a shock to food availability, such as in a drought. This is just one of the expected effects of the lockdown. Now, joining me from Johannesburg is Ntobani Mbele. She's an economist at Nomtho Holdings, and she joins us to take a look at this. Thank you so much for joining me once again, Ntobani. Good to see you.
It's always a pleasure talking to you.
All right, so let's get into a bit of background before we fast forward to where South Africa is currently. So COVID-19 only exacerbated some of the economic issues that South Africa was facing. They had entered a second recession in Q4 of 2019, which was the second in 2 years. Can you take us into what led to that recession in Q4 of 2019?
Absolutely. And so you remember that South Africa as an economy was struggling with, one, being able to keep the economic activity happening during that time. We also had, really harsh situations around the economic growth propensity in South Africa during the time. It was also during the time where there was a lot of uncertainty when it came to political stability. So all of those things were factors that also affected the economic growth propensity of the economy, as well as our ability to keep economic activity in a level that yields growth. And so those were some of the primary factors. The issue of electricity was always going to be a consideration during that time. As you remember, load shedding had become the order of the day during the late 2019 era. And you also know that we had the fiscal challenge where we were borrowing a lot of debt globally, and that was a very considerable effect towards our growth. And so those are some of the highlight measures that led to the recession during the fourth quarter of 2019.
All right, so let's go ahead and fast forward to now and add the COVID-19 pandemic to the mix. So this is just now going to be a storm in a teacup for South Africa. So before the adjusted lockdown regulations were announced last week, there had been some efforts to reopen South Africa's economy when the numbers seemed to have dipped and when the vaccines had started rolling out. Up to last week, how had the pandemic affected South Africa's economy?
So up until last week, you'd know that South Africa, the 2020 GDP figure on the year-on-year rate had contracted by 7%. and you had the so just to give you like a holistic picture, you had a contraction of GDP by 7% for the full year. You had the what do you call this? You had the Monetary Policy Committee being the one who had to kind of intervene more rigorously in the policy front by reducing the repo rate unprecedentedly by 300 basis points, which we've never experienced.
Yeah.
You have had unemployment figures also just came out for the first quarter of 2021, I beg your pardon. And youth unemployment, when you look at the official definition, is around 63.6%. But when you look at the official, the extended, and I think the more real rate of unemployment for young people in South Africa, it's around 74%. And so these are all effects of COVID. And then, as you know, that with economics, the effects come later. So they don't always happen instantaneously. They have a normal 12 to 18 months. And so we are seeing the effects of COVID. You also have, CPI, which is also below the midpoint that is targeted by the Reserve Bank. It just came out and the print was around 4.4% for the month of May. And so you're recognizing the fact that there is definitely, a huge significant impact that has been led by COVID. You have retrenchment that, unprecedented, especially in the labor-intensive industries, mining, manufacturing, where most of the manufacturing hubs have closed down because of limited global, mobility and restriction. Because you can't take your steel to China, you had to let people go. And so those were the direct effects of COVID in the South African economy. Okay. So when you also look at the financial market, right, you also look at how it's only now recovering and being able to generate form of revenue. And we are also, in a very beneficial time right now, where the rand is appreciating around 13.65 rand to the US dollar. And that is something that we haven't seen for around 3 years. And so that is on the more benefit and more positive side. It's what we're seeing to be kind of assisting us to get back into the road of recovery as an economy.
All right. So when President Cyril Ramaphosa announced the adjusted lockdown regulations, there was something that a lot of people were anticipating hearing about, and that was a possible new alcohol ban. So in 2020, it was said that there were more than 100 days of alcohol bans in that year. And the government had said that they were banning the alcohol because they saw that there was some kind of link between it and the infection rate. But we've also seen people from South Africa's alcohol industry come out and say that if you do this, we're going to end up in economic abyss. That was one of the statements. That was the phrase, the description used in recent times. So they had said that they needed it lifted. About 250,000 South Africans, if not more, are employed by this industry. So what do you think was behind the fact that Cyril Ramaphosa's government decided not to ban alcohol when they did this new adjusted restrictions? Is it monetary? Is it social? What do you think is the drive behind it?
I think without a shadow of a doubt, it's definitely monetary. It's a monetary economic consideration. As you understand, the economy has definitely felt the wrath, and we already were a very high unemployment rate economy. And if you then, as a government, do not facilitate a way that is mutually beneficial for the alcohol industry as well as for the economy, I think it would have been, in a much more undesirable position economically. So I do applaud them for, ensuring that bars do not get closed, because a lot of young people in this economy are employed, in those social environments. Yeah. Yes, they do. They are, environments that do create more risks towards COVID. But what we also know is that as an economy, we cannot afford a hard lockdown anymore. We have to have an adjusted lockdown that is considerable to the economic ramifications that are going to be, the result if they do take a hard lockdown stance. So I do think it was definitely monetary. I also do think that he has been in conversation with a lot of industries to speak and find ways that are going to, one, kind of manage and mitigate the risk of having high infection rates in South Africa. But secondly, I think also make sure that they don't themselves lose more revenue and in turn have to let go of staff.
All right, so let's get into some of the details we're hearing. So South Africa's Bureau of Economic Research has said that if the restriction continues and if the intensity as well as the duration of the third wave can be contained, the associated setback to the domestic GDP recovery should be relatively limited. Do you agree with this stance from the Bureau of Economic Research, that it could be a limited in terms of domestic GDP recovery, depending on the duration and the intensity of this particular third wave, as well as the adjusted lockdown?
Absolutely. I think they are extremely correct, particularly because the Bureau of Economic Research monitor economic data as and when it comes out. Mm-hmm. And they also are fantastic, forecasters that are used by commercial banks in South Africa, like the likes of ABSA as well as First National Bank. And so I do think that they are very accurate in saying that, if the economic ramifications will definitely, be affected if the third wave is not looked in or addressed, or even, not even addressed, but even, preempted by an economic position from the government that looks at the data and finds a better way of engaging. So I do think that they're absolutely correct in the presentation and their view of the third wave. I do think that the third wave is a chance. We've already had two waves as an economy. Yeah. The third wave is a chance for us to ensure that in managing the infection rates, and because we already do have a rollout, interesting to inform you is that we've got Dis-Chem as well as Discovery that are already providing vaccines to the elderly communities in South Africa. And what that does is that it already shows that there is a very proactive stance that the private sector is also taking, and not the responsibility not only now solely, is dependent on the government, but you also have initiative being taken by the private sector. And so that is very proactive and in helping us deal better with the third wave.
All right. Ntobani, we're going to take a quick break. This is, of course, Business Edge right here on News Central. When we come back, we'll continue the conversation at the economic effect of the lockdown in South Africa. We want to look at the hospitality sector, the manufacturing sector as well, and we have to face the elephant in the room. South Africa's unemployment figures, the highest on record. We'll get into that when we come back. You're watching Business Edge on News Central, and my guest is still with me. From Johannesburg, I have Ntobani Mbele. She is an economist who's joining us on the show as we take a look at the economic effect of South Africa's lockdown. So, Ntobani, I wanted to ask about these adjusted lockdown regulations, particularly as it pertains to the hospitality sector. And as you made mention of, that's a sector that employs a lot of young South Africans. With the new restrictions, which we know now, they also apply to gatherings of both political and religious inclinations. They apply to bars, taverns, and restaurants. Has there been any sort of bailouts, any sort of financial assistance that has gone to maybe not just this sector, but to any sector in South Africa because of the lockdown? What has government done to sort of cushion the effects for these sectors?
So the government has been quite impressive with providing the small business relief fund that had put aside around, I think if I'm correct, around 100 billion towards assisting small businesses. To confirm to date, I am subject to being corrected, but around 16% of those funds have been used by businesses to kind of remedial and put themselves in an economic position to mitigate the risk, and not the financial, but the financial loss from the lockdown effect. Having said that, 16% is quite substantially small.
Yes.
And so most businesses have had to, shut down and have to let go of employees. And so the question becomes, is the application and the access to this funding readily available for business, or is a lot of economic and financial red tape that makes businesses not to be able to access those funds? So in as much as government has made initiatives to assist businesses, why is it not getting traction in the small business environment? That becomes a question that government still has to answer, but you can say that they have definitely put in an effect to assist businesses, but why is it not materializing is a question of concern.
All right.
When we speak of the hospitality industry, that definitely has been one of the most hampered, hampered industries as a result of COVID, because if there is economic restrictions and there's mobility restrictions and you really can't travel interprovincial, then you definitely are going to find that people that work in those industries, which are locals in most of the peripheries outside of Johannesburg, in KZN, in Mpumalanga, who are the epicenter, the epicenter of the economic hub being hospitality, it then becomes, a very problematic stance. But as you can see recently, people have, the South African tourism department has definitely been encouraging people to travel and to go into the hospitality, resorts to kind of reboost that economy. And I do think that I've seen a lot of people on socials being able to travel, of course, ensuring that the regulations are still being followed. Yes. People are still wearing their mask, and sanitizers are still being used in those facilities.
All right. So now as we go from the hospitality sector, we have to talk about unemployment. So as you said, hospitality is one of the hardest hits, but manufacturing has been hit as well, even though it was hit before now because of the rolling blackouts and the load shedding and Eskom's basically hampered activities. What we also know now is that data from Statistics SA shows that the official unemployment rate has marginally increased, but it has hit a record high, 32.6%, moving from 32.5% in Q4 of 2020. This is the highest figure since the quarterly labor force report came to be in 2008. Even though it's a marginal increase, what's accounting for this?
What is accounting for this is definitely the effect of COVID. It's definitely manufacturing, mining, as well as hospitality, because those are primarily the more labor, human-intensive industries. But I think when you look at the marginal figure from 32.5 to 32.6, it would be incorrect for us not to look at the expanded definition of unemployment. You'd remember that the official definition of unemployment looks at people who are actively seeking for employment. When you look at the expanded definition, it looks at people who have also just stopped looking for employment, and who are discouraged. Now, having said that, those people who are discouraged are the real number of unemployed people in the South African economy. So if you look at the marginal rate, it's not really marginal when you look at the actual figures. As I've alluded to you earlier, youth unemployment in South Africa, for the expanded definition, so those are people that are around age 15 towards 35, is around 74.7%.
Wow.
Now that is marginal, and that is significant. And when you look at a range, which is a very important group of individuals, being young Black females in South Africa. Those people are, the rate of them being unemployed is around, I think, around 36%, 38%. That is important to look into, particularly because women and young Black women in South Africa are the larger population, number one, so they account for the larger portion of the population. And two, they have the highest multiplier effect if they have income towards providing to their families. If one woman gets employed in South Africa, they are able to feed around 10 people.
Wow.
And so that already shows you that if young Black females are not employed, it becomes a much dire situation for households in South Africa, particularly marginalized households, which characterize the large population of the South African economy. And so when you look at the figure, one can't say that it's marginal. You have to look at the real effect and the real implication of the labor survey and what it means for Black South African communities, as well as other marginalized people in the economy.
Okay, I want to ask a two-part question as we start wrapping things up. In terms of the economics, as you said, when these things happen, we have to wait sometimes 18 months, 16 months, 24 months to see the true effect. But in terms of these new adjusted restrictions, what do you think the impact will be on the figures of unemployment? Adding to that, what is the government doing to address the fact that more than 2 million South Africans are unemployed in the middle of a recession, in the middle of economic shutdown that has come because of the coronavirus?
So let me start with the latter question. The South African government has publicly said that their focus for this year is to focus on economically rebuilding the economy. And at the core of it is, looking at providing entrepreneurial facilitation for young people, because they understand that we can no longer be an economy that seeks and waits for jobs, but one that is supposed to create employment. And so unemployment therefore becomes, entrepreneurship becomes the centerpiece that will be able to, rebuild the South African economy. So there has been a lot of initiatives that the state has been putting towards encouraging young people, particularly from marginalized communities, to, use initiatives that are, the issue of fourth industrial revolution. Yeah. So to have ideas that are revolving around the natural progression of the global economy in a way that will ensure that they create employment, that they stay contemporary in the global economy and can compete globally. And I think that will be the best way, I think in their effort to address the issue of unemployment. When you look at the first question you asked about the lockdown restrictions, I think these lockdown restrictions are not going to materially affect employment in the South African economy because, as you know, clubs normally would be closing around 2 a.m., but 10 is a reasonable time. We also do have to ask the hard question of, do we save livelihoods over lives? And because the penetration of the vaccine distribution in South Africa is not at the level that it's supposed to be. Yes, as much as the phase 2 rollout is much more speediest than the initial one, it's still not at the rate that speaks to the population and the need of vaccination for the population. And so I do think that it was done in moderation. I do think that the government at this point did really the best that they could. And I do not see the second quarter unemployment figures being reflective of this lockdown restriction.
All right. We'll keep touch, of course, to find out how things are developing and playing out with South Africa's economy, the most industrialized on the continent, and a lot of economic growth for Southern Africa is also hinged on progress within South Africa. Ntobani Mbele, thank you so much for joining me from Johannesburg. Thank you so much. All right, that is how we wrap up this conversation as we take a look, of course, on the economic effects of the lockdown in South Africa. And as we keep things rolling, we'll take a quick time out. And when we come back, we have NC4 to watch. And as we wrap up the show today, let's give you a few stories we're keeping our eyes on. This is NC4 to watch. And first on our list, we start in South Africa, where we just left our conversation. Now, South Africa's power utility Eskom Holdings has announced that it will cut power supplies nationwide until Friday after more breakdowns at some of its facilities. The state-owned company said it would extend cuts of 2,000 megawatts from the grid because of shortages caused by 2 plant failures. Now, Eskom, which has faced delays in restarting 2 of its other generating units that were being serviced, said it's forced to ration power further after exhausting emergency reserves. Number 2 on the list, Mozambique has begun construction of gas-to-power plant and transmission line projects worth $1 billion in the southern province of Inhambane as the government aims to boost energy supply. The World Bank is one of the financing partners of the infrastructure projects alongside the U.S., Norway, the African Development Bank, the Islamic Bank, and the OPEC Fund for International Development. Third on our list, Nigeria's external reserves lost $640 million in May, falling to $34.24 billion as at May 28 from $34.88 billion at April 28. Figures obtained from the Central Bank of Nigeria reveal the reserves have been fluctuating in recent weeks. And finally, we head to number 4. Inflation in Kenya increased from 5.76% in April to 5.87% in May 2021, following an increase in food and transport costs. A monthly report from the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics attributes the modest increase to higher cost of transport, food, and non-alcoholic beverages. The cost of food and non-alcoholic beverages rose by 1.26% month on month and 7.36% year on year. And that's Business Edge for you. Thank you so much for joining us. And of course, you can follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. And of course, download our mobile app on your Google app and Play Store. Until next time, I'm Tolulope Adeleru Balogun.